Well, good afternoon. What I'd like to do today is to move on to a unit on the effects of human health. As part of this, we'll look at indoor air quality. We'll look and also at OSHA regulations. So this is probably one of the most medical physiological lectures you'll have in engineering. But I do think it's really important to have some sense of the human anatomy, especially as it relates to the respiratory system, so that you have some understanding of how chemicals affect the human body. So we talk about the upper respiratory system or the upper respiratory tract. You've got what feels like a cold. You go to the doctors and they tell you that you have an upper respiratory tract infection. What that means is that the infection is in this portion of the respiratory system. So it's in the nasal cavities, it's in the pharynx, the larynx, and in the trachea. It's in that upper portion. We also talk about the lower respiratory infections. Those are much more serious. And now we're looking at a infection there in the lungs. So we're looking at the bronchi. So you've got the bronchial tube here. It divides into the bronchi. It further divides into what are referred to as bronchioles, ultimately into the alveoli. And all this is within the lungs. Now the lungs expand upward and downward by the movement of the diaphragm. So the diaphragm plays a very significant role, actually, in the breathing process. And that positive or negative pressure in the lungs is what ensures that gases, mainly oxygen and CO2, are exchanged from the bloodstream, or in the case of CO2, or in the case of oxygen, into the bloodstream. The differential atmospheric pressures are actually extremely small. They're only about 1 millimeter mercury, which is about 0.00131 atmospheres. So that differential pressure is extremely small, but extremely important because it is what ensures that oxygen is transferred across the alveoli membranes and into the bloodstream. Now, we can look closer at this. So what is referred to as the nasopharyngeal region, or the upper airways, is between the nostrils and the larynx. So the larynx is what we often refer to as the voice box. It includes what is referred to as the nasal turbinates. These are later on we'll talk about air scrubbers. These are mucus tissue that's covered with mucous membrane, and it transfers energy and water vapor. So, for instance, on a day like today, there's very little humidity in the air. When you're breathing that air, what happens then is these nasal turbinates actually humidify the air. So moisture from these organs are actually adding water vapor. It's actually dehydrating you, which is why it's really important, even in cold weather, to maintain hydration, because that air is being moisturized. There's also transfer of water vapor back to these tissues when air is exhaled. The other thing to recognize when we're talking about the respiratory system and air pollutant is that as the air moves into the upper airways through the larynx, it's constricted in the larynx. And that's what enables you to hear me and for me to be able to utter sound. But the problem with that is that because of that constriction of airflow, deposition of particulate matter is very significant in the larynx. So it's not one type of cancer that smokers are susceptible to is a cancer of the larynx. Why? Because that particulate matter from the cigarette smoke deposits in the larynx. It contains toxic and carcinogenic chemicals, and that can result in malignant tumors in the larynx. The tracheobronchial region is further deeper into the respiratory system, and that includes the trachea. And what is shown here are these rings of cartilage that support the trachea. Now, all of the passageways in the trachea, in the so here's the bronchi, in the bronchiole, are coated with a thin layer of mucus, and that mucus is extremely important in the body's protective mechanisms against foreign material. These are also lined with this ciliated epithelium. You can see the cilia in the image here. This is actually a scanning electron micrograph of the lining of a bronchiole. The cilia actually create a sweeping mechanism. So you can kind of think of these as a gigantic broom. And the idea is, and the way that they work, is that these cilia have a whip-like motion. They can move back and forth in about 10 to 20 times per second. There's about 200 cilia per cell, and these cilia are can sweep particulate matter from the lungs up mainly into the digestive system. So they're a way of ridding the body of foreign material. This process is referred to as mucociliary escalation. So it involves mucous membranes, involves the cilia, and it's this escalation, kind of think of it as an escalator, sweeping this material up out of the lungs. Now, the terminal bronchiole have alveoli at the end. So the end of these contain these alveoli. There's roughly 300 to 500 million alveoli in an adult human. So you can see it here. So you've got the bronchiole, and at the end of the bronchiole are these sacs of alveoli. It's across the alveolar membrane, you see here, that oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse. So oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream and carbon dioxide diffuses from the bloodstream. So we exhale carbon dioxide, we're inhaling and transferring oxygen to the bloodstream. And about 90 to 95% of the surfaces of the alveoli are actually covered with capillaries, which is what's shown here. So you have a tremendous amount of area across which the gases can diffuse. Now, what happens when you're exposed to gases? A number of things can happen. It can aggravate your sense of smell. That can cause sneezing or coughing. Some chemicals will actually inactivate the sweeping motion of the cilia, which then means that the body's defense mechanism is reduced and the body isn't able to rid itself of this foreign material. And then the particles can also deposit in the larynx, as I mentioned before. When gases actually reach the lower respiratory system, they can have additional effects. Cyanosis is when skin turns blue. What's happening there is that there's not enough oxygen, so the hemoglobin is becoming deoxygenated, which is why you see a person becoming blue. Often the lips turn blue first, and then the rest of their skins will turn blue. Hypercapnia is excessive CO2 in the blood. So that CO2 isn't being transferred from the bloodstream into the air in the alveoli. And it's building up in the bloodstream. Dyspnea is this anxious feeling that one cannot get when they can't breathe. So very common for those that have asthma attacks. It's actually observed in those that are suffering from COVID, and it's actually affecting their breathing. Just realize that you're having trouble breathing, and there's that anxious feeling. And hypoxia is an insufficient amount of oxygen, so that metabolic activity becomes reduced. What does this relate, or how does this relate to environmental engineering? If you're working in an environment or exposed for whatever reason to contaminants, the question is, how do those contaminants affect human health? For example, ozone is a gas for which we have a National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So we have it for ozone. Why? Why ozone? Anybody know anything about ozone?
Is it a lung irritant?
Sure, what was it?
Is it a lung irritant?
It's a lung irritant, exactly. Those of you that took 483, what did we use ozone for?
Disinfection.
For disinfection. Why did we use ozone for disinfection? It's highly reactive. So, in fact, it's more reactive than chlorine, which is why in many cases we do use ozone. Now, the issue is if ozone is highly reactive, what does that mean in terms of human health?
It'll react in the lungs?
It'll react in your body. It actually will react even before it gets to the lungs. So think about the air you breathe. If you're breathing through your nose, which is what we hopefully commonly do, breathe more through our mouth when we exercise, but we're breathing in, the air goes through the nasal passages, so across the nasal turbinates. If there is ozone in that air, what happens? It's going to react with that tissue. And if it reacts with the tissue, it can cause irritation, it can cause necrosis, death of the tissue, if it's sufficient. So typically for chemicals that are very reactive, they're going to react in the upper airway or the upper respiratory system. They're less likely to get into the blood because they're reacting. Now they're going to cause damage. It's not that they're not going to cause damage. It just means that they're not likely to get into the bloodstream. The other thing to think about is the contaminant soluble in water? Thinking again at ozone, ozone has a low solubility. So it's a low solubility, so it's going to do the most damage in the upper respiratory system. If it gets down into the lungs, it will do damage in the lungs, but it will, for the most part, the reactions occur in the upper respiratory system. If it does get into the lower lungs, what's happening is it's going to react with the mucus. And we think of it, mucus often as gross. You get a cold, you get this excess mucus. It is really gross. That mucus is critical for our survival. What happens then is it reacts with the mucus, attacks tissue, and it reduces what we refer to as the FEV, or the forced expiratory volume. So it's the volume of air that you can actually exhale. If you see the ads on TV for COPD, person that has COPD can't exhale. It's the exhaling part that is actually diminished. And because it's diminished, it means that their ability to transfer oxygen and CO2 is also diminished. Now, a chemical like SO2 is soluble in water. So what does that mean? Soluble in water, what?
It can make it into the bloodstream.
It can get into the bloodstream, okay? So here it's going to react with the mucus, so you're going to, and potentially there can move then into the bloodstream. So one of the things when you're looking at how these chemicals react or how they affect human health, number of factors that you want to look at is solubility. So for example, carbon monoxide and many volatile organic chemicals, for instance, benzene, have a low solubility. Then another thing, how reactive are they? So carbon monoxide and many VOCs are not very reactive. So what does that mean? What's the impact? So if something has a low solubility, they're not going to be removed in the upper airways. They're going to move into the alveoli. They're not reactive. They're going to get into the alveoli. Now what happens?
Are they just going to persist and damage the alveoli?
They're going to get into the alveoli, right? And what do we say? We had a lot of capillaries there. So we have a lot of possibility or potential for mass transfer. So they're going to accumulate, but what else are they going to do?
Into the blood.
You're going to go from the alveoli. So if we go back and look here, you've got all these capillaries. So and you can see it here. If we have, now instead we have carbon monoxide, or maybe we have some benzene in here, that crosses the membrane into the capillary and into the bloodstream. So now you have these chemicals. So for instance, benzene or carbon monoxide moves then across the alveoli membranes into the bloodstream. Carbon monoxide actually binds to hemoglobin better than oxygen does. So it will preferentially bind to oxygen. Blood becomes deoxygenated, and that's how people suffocate from carbon monoxide. VOCs get into the bloodstream, and with the VOCs, these then are often then transported to target organs. So for instance, via benzene, target organ is liver. So it gets into the bloodstream. The liver tries to detoxify the blood. It accumulates in the liver and can result in liver cancer. So how the behavior of these chemicals, the chemical properties of these chemicals has a significant impact on how they affect human health. Okay, let's look at an example. And in this case here, you're an officer in the Navy, you're on submarine duty, and you're responsible for an air purification system that automatically generates oxygen to maintain an oxygen to nitrogen molar ratio of 0.2. Carbon monoxide and CO2 are monitored on a continuous basis. Why? Why is this done? Why do we care?
Because on a submarine, they don't have the ability to dissipate.
Okay, so you may be, I don't know how many hundreds of feet, thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean. You've got sailors on board. They're generating carbon monoxide. If you didn't remove it, that carbon monoxide would build up and the oxygen levels would decrease. So we need to maintain a sufficient level of oxygen. We need to be able to strip that CO2 from the atmosphere. So the officer that is in charge, has set the carbon monoxide monitor at 250,000 parts per million. So this is what it was set at. Carbon monoxide has a permissible exposure limit. This would be set by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, at 35 parts per million. There's no PEL, there's no permissible exposure limit set for CO2. The moisture content is at 3.5%. It's on a molar basis. And the question is, have you set that monitor properly? Is CO2 a problem? So how would I approach this problem? So how do I approach this problem? What do I know? Okay. PEL is a permissible exposure limit. It's a regulatory limit set by OSHA, or Occupational Safety and Health Administration, for the maximum level that would be allowable in an occupational environment. So we'll talk about these in greater detail next week, but just know that this is a level that would be considered the maximum level acceptable in this environment. It's a good question. So what do we know? What components do we have in this environment? What are the gases? We've got oxygen, right? We've got nitrogen. We have carbon monoxide. We have carbon dioxide. And we have water vapor. So we have 5 components in this system. So we've got nitrogen, oxygen, water vapor, CO2, and we've got CO. Dalton's law of partial pressures said that we could write an expression that the total pressure is equal to the partial pressure of each of these components. Now, if we divide each of these by the total pressure, so I'm going to divide all of these by the total pressure, I now have an expression that 1 is equal to the mole fraction, so we use Y for mole fraction of nitrogen plus the mole fraction of oxygen plus the mole fraction of water vapor plus, this should be Y, CO2 plus the mole fraction of carbon monoxide. Now, the mole fraction of water vapor is equal to what?
3.5%.
3.5%, or 0.035. If the alarm goes off, the mole fraction of CO2 is equal to, so it was 250,000 parts per million. That is equal to 0.25. For simplicity here, we'll use the mole fraction, so we'll use the PEL for carbon monoxide, and that is 3.5 times 10 to the minus 5. We also know that the ratio, this was given, the ratio of nitrogen to the ratio of oxygen is equal to 0.25. So we can now substitute back in here, and I just wrote this backwards, sorry. This is YO2 over YN2. So I can substitute in here that the mole fraction of nitrogen is equal to YO2 over 0.25 plus YO2 plus 0.035 plus 0.25 plus 3.5 times 10 to the minus 5, which is negligible. So if I solve for the mole fraction of O2, that is equal to 0.143 or 14.3%. So that, given these conditions, the air in the submarine contains 14.3%. Given this information about oxygen levels, is there a problem?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so we're right in here. Poor muscle coordination, rapid fatigue. Your sailors are becoming very, very tired. They're having trouble breathing. That level is significantly below the 19.5% defined as a lower limit for the oxygen level. And this is by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So what do? You're in charge. Now what?
Reset the alarms and make them more sensitive.
Reset the alarms to make it more sensitive, exactly. Okay. And we could go through and we could calculate that, or we're not going to do that, but we could. And we could set this, for instance, at, we want some buffer, we could set this to 20%, in which case then we can solve for the level that the alarm should be set at. So all we've done here is we've just used Dalton's law of partial pressure to determine a safe level, or what that alarm should be set at. We can also look at this in terms of carbon dioxide. There have been a number of studies done to look at the effect of carbon dioxide levels in classrooms, office environments on cognitive function. And this paper looked at it in terms of a whole series of activities, from what they refer to as applied activity level to task orientation to information usage, to strategy, ability to strategize. And what you can see, for instance, here is that the range that we typically want the CO2 levels to be in a classroom or a work environment is typically in about this region here. So we want it under 800 parts per million. Now remember, background level, if you went and measured CO2 level out in the ambient environment, it's typically will be around 440 or so parts per million in around mid-Michigan. So you're never going to get it much lower than that in most environments. But what do you see? Looking at information usage, breadth of approach, ability to strategize. Does CO2 have an effect on cognitive function? For those categories, absolutely. Okay. So the next time you're in a classroom and the capacity of the room, actually EB 3400, that corner room has a capacity in that room of about 70. Normal years, I've taught 489 in that room. During an exam, the CO2 levels are out here. So what does that tell you? Is it important?
They didn't do as well on the exam.
Exactly. Good. Now you can say you didn't do as well in the exam because the CO2 levels in the room went up and therefore your ability to strategize went down. And actually that happens. I started monitoring CO2 levels in the classroom and actually did work with Jeff to try and improve ventilation in the classroom so that the CO2 levels didn't build up and the classroom is high. There's fair amount of discussion right now, and I'm debating how to do this with the project too, but looking at CO2 levels to determine whether or not there's sufficient ventilation in a building in order to mitigate transmission of COVID. Why? Why does anybody care about CO2 and COVID?
If there's excess CO2, there isn't proper ventilation.
Exactly. If there's high levels of CO2, there's improper or insufficient ventilation. COVID is airborne. It's transmitted through the air. So if there isn't sufficient ventilation and someone has COVID and they're expelling the virus, it's going to hang in the air. Remember the Harper's incident back in July? How does that all relate? We don't have CO2 measurements for Harper's, but still, how does it relate?
Bars don't have good ventilation.
Okay. Bars don't necessarily have good ventilation. Okay. Harper's, as I remember, did a tour for 495 on years ago. That basement is pretty low ceiling, so you're not going to get good ventilation. You don't have good ventilation. Someone is ill. They're expelling the virus as they're breathing, talking. It hangs in the air. So not only does the CO2 level build up, but so does the viral load in the air. And then you're exposed to that as you breathe. So there's quite a bit of discussion right now about using CO2 levels as an indicator really of sufficient ventilation and whether or not steps need to be taken to improve ventilation in order to try and mitigate transmission of the virus. We can also look at carbon monoxide. This is a plot showing the carbon monoxide concentrations versus exposure time. So you can see, and notice this is a semi-log plot. So for instance, if you look here at right here, 1 hour exposure, and this is 2, 3, 4, 5, about 500 here. So you can be exposed for about 1 hour at 500 parts per million. You will observe some sickness. If, on the other hand, you're at home at about 95 parts per million for 7 hours, you're going to see effects. And then notice at 7 hours, doesn't have to go much higher. At 200, those concentrations are deadly. 1 hour, you're looking at concentrations of roughly about 1,500 in order to have a response where it would actually kill someone. And this is one of the things that when I show this, I also want to suggest that if you don't have a carbon monoxide monitor in your home and you have a gas furnace, what's my recommendation? Get a carbon monoxide monitor. Every winter, it seems that somewhere someone doesn't have one. The furnace isn't working properly. If the furnace isn't working properly, it's emitting carbon monoxide in high concentrations. The carbon monoxide builds up in the house. It's odorless, colorless, and the problem is it affects the cognitive function. So by the time your ability to process what's happening is diminished, and that's in part 2 why people suffocate. Get yourself a carbon monoxide monitor if you don't have one. And this just gives you a little more information about the effects of carbon monoxide. How about oxygen? Oxygen can be deadly. Typically, you're not going to observe that except in if scuba diving, issues related to oxygen therapy, where the levels are too high, but typically not something that we typically have to deal with. But oxygen can be toxic. I think what I'll do is just maybe we'll talk a little bit about definitions for particles, and I think then we'll probably stop there and we'll pick up the rest on Friday. But just some definitions here. We talk about aerodynamic diameter, and that is the diameter of a spherical water droplet that has the same terminal settling velocity as the particle. When we look at sedimentation, we'll use Stokes' law in order to determine the terminal settling velocity. And I think we'll do this also. We'll look at issues again with COVID and the size of droplets that are expelled. And we'll look at how long those droplets can actually remain in the air. And I'm thinking we'll relate that to Project 2 and have you do some indoor air modeling in that way. But definitions vary. So we talk about inhalable particles. US EPA defines that as particles that have a diameter less than 10 microns. The American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists uses the term respirable particles and defines that as those particles with a diameter less than 2.5 microns. Fine particles are typically defined as particles less than 2.5 microns, coarse as greater than 2.5 microns. So the definitions that we use for particles vary with agencies, with regulations, with really who's using these terms. They play a very important role, though, in the effects of human health. We can think of, when we talk about COVID, we can think about those virins as a particle. And actually, for the most part, the virus particles are actually encased in water droplets. So when you sneeze, the virus isn't what we call naked, okay? It's actually inside water particles. So I think I'll stop there, and we'll pick up with the mechanisms and removal on Friday. Any questions about what we've covered today?
I actually have a question about the calculations we did. So when you divide the total pressure, like when you divide everything by the total pressure, why would it be a mole fraction and not a mass fraction?
Okay, so couple things. This was stated as a molar ratio, so it's a mole fraction. Okay, our parts per million are actually as a volume because we have PV equals nRT. Volume is proportional to the molar ratio. So those ratios on a volumetric basis and a molar basis are equivalent. If you think it's worth it, I can go through this maybe on Friday, a set of calculations to show you that. But volume is directly proportional to moles, which is why those are equivalent. It's not true for mass because the molecular weights change. Okay, but on a volumetric basis, the volumetric fraction and the molar fraction are equivalent. And that's why I can use those interchangeably there.
Okay, that makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Mine is more just of a thought rather than a question, Professor. So as you discussed that the CO2 emission levels in the engineering building, because a lot of students are there, decreases, which is why people don't do good in their exams. Can it be said that because right now, because of online classes, if we take exams in our home, we tend to do better because of that? Or is it not that big of an impact?
It depends on how crowded the classroom is. So actually, I think it's either 2,400 or 3,400, I forget now which. It's the room with the big long tables. And,
oh, okay, yeah, I remember, yep.
Okay. So in a normal year, when I'm teaching 49, while that room supposedly has a capacity for 70, it really doesn't. So on an exam day, that room is packed.
Yep.
And typically the class before 489 in that room is also crowded. So the CO2 levels are actually, when I was monitoring it, were quite high to start with. And then you've got a crowded classroom.
Okay.
And that CO2 levels would reach somewhere 1,800, 2,000 in the classroom. So it's well above that 1,500. So yeah, so there's definitely the potential for cognitive function to decrease in that sort of an environment.
Okay, so but does it then us taking an exam in house help because it's probably with less people around us, just us by ourselves in a room?
Yes, CO2 levels should be low enough in your home that it shouldn't impact it. You're absolutely right.
Okay, got it.
So I
That's
mean,
very,
to be able to say yes, it's definitively the reason is really hard.
oh no, I'm just saying in that specific aspect.
But yes, it has the potential to actually improve performance on exams because you're not in this crowded environment where CO2 is building up.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much, Professor, for answering my question. Appreciate
No
it.
problem. I know it is really interesting. It wasn't until I started looking at this and I had a student doing an independent study that I started looking at, and then I started monitoring CO2 levels, and they can be quite high in some classrooms.
That's very. I'll definitely keep that in mind next time when we get back in person. If there's something I notice something, that's really cool. Thank you so much, Professor. Have a great day.
No problem.